Hello,
It's
everyone.
John Persona.
Huh? Hmm?
It's John Persona.
Hello, John Persona.
Okay, anyways, my bad.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with my good friend John Persona. Say hi.
Hi. That's not actually my name, but
Yeah,
anyways.
Sasha.
Yep.
And this is a brief history of Persona and SMT. Persona doesn't need much introduction. It was everywhere when it came out. Jokers and Smash, cat.meme. Like, we all know what we're talking about there.
Persona sucks, am I right, fellas?
You are going to be an issue through this whole thing, aren't you? Persona 5 was the first game to not include its parent franchise's branding, Shin Megami Tensei, and SMT goes back a long, weird, and winding route that we'll get into in a minute. If you've been with my channel, you know I think a lot about turn-based RPGs, but it's probably a surprise to a lot of people that Pokemon is not the only game in that genre. Square put out big mainstream classics, but Atlas, they put in the premium product. If you want to see a classic, tough as nails JRPG, you go to them. Most people know them for Persona now. It came to the West with Persona 3. Enthusiasts got in on it. Persona 4 came over. It put Atlas on the map and kind of blew up. Then Persona 5 happened and blew up again. It's led tons and tons of people back through the catalog to appreciate the legacy of finely tuned game design, dickhole bosses, and more than the normal amount of cannibalism. You can feel free to chime in whenever you want, by the way.
Persona sucks, I'm kidding. I love the franchise, obviously, or series. Yeah, I mean, I was definitely one of the people who was new to the series with 5. I started with 5.
We
And
both got into it pretty recently in the grand scheme. We didn't even get to it on release. I got into Persona 5 a few months after it came out, and I used that to springboard into the mainline SMT with, you know, the Nocturnes, the Digital Devil Sagas, the Devil Survivors, and the Strange Journeys, and from there I realized, oh, being bored out of my mind isn't baked into the genre, and I started writing my manifesto. Sasha, your journey into the history has been more focused on Persona, right? You've taken the leap past 3, and you're trying your hand at Persona 2, and I'm pretty sure you have one on your backlog.
Yeah, one is in my backlog. I have played Persona 2. God, I think it's Innocent Sin.
Yeah, Innocent Sin.
Yeah. I've played the first in the duology. The other one is also sitting in my backlog, but they're not too different in terms of their tone and aesthetic. So I think on some level I can speak to authority of that.
Yeah, and so we have someone who's a bit more of an authority on the retro style of Persona, and someone who's a bit more experienced with the stylings of mainline SMT, or as mainline as it gets, because Persona is like spin-off squared. SMT has a lot of vanilla spin-offs.
Yeah, it's a interesting story.
We're going to be going over the different aesthetics that the franchise has gone over, and some of the weird ways that it's evolved and influenced itself and games around it.
Yep.
Yeah. The only fair way to take it, I feel, is to go just from the outset. So we're going to start with Shin Megami Tensei before Persona, before any Persona happened. So Sasha, tell me, like, what do you know about that?
I mean, I know it was kind of like more 2D traditional JRPG stuff. I think it precedes Pokemon, right? Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
That it does. I think it and Dragon Quest Monsters did the whole monster collection thing before Pokemon did.
Japan loves collecting monsters.
I mean, that's
here to hear, folks.
That's just a fact. That's the whole point of all of this, was always bug collecting being a huge hobby for kids.
I mean, maybe it might be bugs, but maybe they actually got monsters there and they're just not telling us.
Yes, I think that my 8-year-old friends tried to gaslight me when they went on vacation to Japan and they had a Blastoise over there.
Dude, real?
I believe
they were right.
Yeah.
Anyways, but
SMT,
yeah, I mean...
SMT, Shin Megami Tensei, to compare it to the Persona games people will actually know, it is definitely a lot grittier. It's apocalyptic. The most consistent aesthetic feature is blasphemy. It's more about the vibes and high concept in the characters. It's got a big emphasis on the surreal. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It riffs on much of the same ideas as Junji Ito, where the characters are not the point of it. The point is that this is a weird setting. Let's see what that means. And words don't really do it justice, because how can you really describe that sort of minimalism? And SMT in an image, to me, is this.
Yeah. I mean, that's just kind of a badass image.
Yeah, it's hazy, it's busy, it's chaotic. It often verges on the grimdark. Like, these settings are a bad time, just all around.
I would also add, I'm going to use this term a lot throughout this, is dreamlike almost. They all have these very surrealist, dreamlike kind of vibes to them. Yeah. It also might be, to some extent, kind of the era that it came out in. The late 90s and 2000s has a lot of
it channels a lot of grunge very well.
Yeah, that's definitely the better word for it.
Persona, the status quo is happy-go-lucky because of the vibrant casts, more bittersweet endings as you leave them behind. SMT yeah. We're speaking to the rule. We're speaking to the rule, not the exceptions. SMT just doesn't do that. Like, what if Persona 5's final act left, like, 3 survivors, destroyed 99% of the infrastructure, and was the inciting incident of the story? That's your baseline for Shin Megami Tensei. Here, I'm remiss to not mention Kazuma Kaneko. He's been a critical artist on the series since its bare beginnings with Megami Tensei 2. Not Shin Megami Tensei, Megami Tensei 2. It's an original sequel to the first Megami Tensei game, which was an adaptation of a trilogy of novels, which tells you a lot about getting into the history of this series.
It's like fucking Nier, right? Like, Nier has like a stage play, and it's like the original Nier game has like absolutely nothing to do with Nier Automata.
It's Drakengard.
Yeah, Drakengard, and it's like, I love this just weird fucking depths of hell lore that some of these game series have.
Yeah, did you know that they had a spin-off that was aimed at children?
I would believe it. I mean, especially
it didn't come over to the West. I wonder why. It was called
I would love to play this game. Oh, dude. I mean, that would be so hard to sell. Yeah,
like that only sells here as horror movies. Kazuma Kaneko, he's still with Atlas. He's known as the demon artist. That's just the thing he does. Which, what a title for a man. He's done heaps upon heaps of character design work for human characters in a lot of SMT games, but in every single spin-off, Persona included, the demons and Persona always run by him. Yoshitaka Amano defines the visual identity of Final Fantasy, Akira Toriyama defines Dragon Quest, Kazuma Kaneko defines Shin Megami Tensei. It's the father, the son, and the other metalhead son of JRPG visual design. Disguised the iPad baby and Neptune's in jail. But Kaneko did stuff for Devil May Cry, actually. He made the devil triggers for Virgil and Dante in DMC3. He's a prolific man, and the series would not be what it is without him. Big props to the man.
I mean, even outside of like the demons and stuff, there a lot of the I'm jumping a little ahead here, but like a lot of the fucking art for Persona and SMT of just like the characters has such a unique, like, it's a very anime style obviously, but has such a very unique, I want to say like bleak look to it. Like, if you post some of that art of like the early like Persona 3 and Persona 4 art before it kind of got like super anime-y and kind of like more. Yeah, it's very stylized and very cool. So
Kaneko does do a lot of that. He excels in a similar way to Junji Ito, where everybody looks genuinely very pensive and thoughtful. It doesn't often produce the most memorable casts, because Persona is where he's more relegated to just the demon designs. He does create striking characters that do make their mark on their games in a very minimalist fashion. But in 2003, he stepped up from his usual character design role to full-on creative director of Shin Megami Tensei 3, a game that got an updated re-release called Shin Megami Tensei 3 Maniacs, which was released to PAL regions as Shin Megami Tensei Lucifer's Call, and to the Americas, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. I am going to stick to the acronym now. The updated re-release bullshit that everyone complains about Atlas pulling, it's literally the only reason they have a Western presence. It's very funny to hear people complaining about Royal and Golden for that.
I mean, it's not uncommon for names to change when they're being translated, sometimes to like an extreme. I know Ghost in the Shell is a really good example of that, because I think, let me double check real quick, but I think the Japanese for a name is like Kokaku Kidotai, which is just like Shell Squad or like Armored Riot Police, and like that is such a huge difference between like the fucking Western name of Ghost in the Shell.
I'm learning things about Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, Ghost in the Shell is a significantly better title, but moving back to Persona.
Or specifically SMT pre-Persona.
SMT.
Yeah. SMT at its best is playing off of eldritch claustrophobia. A lot of arbitrarily repeating patterns and very visible tiling. It's either very dense, isolated geometry or desolate agoraphobia. An empty desert, a wide open city, or a tiny sanctuary in an empty ocean. To be pretentious, I have it written in my notes as hypersymmetrical cubist brutalism.
Yeah, something like that.
It's, the series has slid in and out of science fiction and a purer fantasy. The sci-fi peaks in Digital Devil Saga 1 and Devil Survivor, and it almost wholly disappears for Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne and Persona. The music, it's always a hard rock, hard synth, chaotic chorus of hell. There's a lot of metal sensibility in there, and that's definitely the most consistent part of the aesthetic. You find blaring synths in the Nocturne themes, you find extremely distorted and borderline unintelligible vocals in Fierce Battle in a lot of very prominent tracks. You have the Minotaur theme, you have, of course, Fierce Battle, you have Moral Guardian terrifying music. And it sells no small part of the fantasy, because SMT is in large part about finding the apocalypse and taking it in your own hand. Whether that be turning it to your will to revert it to normal, taking control of it in a more conventional way, or using it to wage a war against something still greater. The stories of these games, minimal as they often are about that apotheosis. And it is a really effective way to tie a player's mastery over a relatively complex combat system into the story. You become that terror with a party of unfeeling death machines who develop an efficiency to punch out God.
Punch out, yeah. I mean, I think that's just a series theme. Just the games ending with fighting God.
Again, blasphemy. Every day. These games say the name Yahweh repeatedly, at least in the originals, which they do a lot of religious research into these demons for their depictions, and they know how much of a deal that is to say Yahweh.
I mean, essentially, Persona and the SMT kind of monster roster covers most big mythologies and religions, and which I actually kind of appreciate, because it gives a kind of a thematic overhead to a lot of the creatures that exist in it.
Yes.
Pokemon's problem, at least with the newer gens for me, is SMT's kind of had the same roster for like actual decades at this point.
Yeah, it has expanded gradually, but they do play a lot off of the same tropes. Persona, it's not quite as religious. SMT is always very, very religious in its theming. It does feature monsters from all manner of pantheons from throughout history, but the overarching conflicts are very heavily Christianized. I'm willing to attribute that to the fact that the iconography just is seen as exotic and cool over in Japan. So it's not really making a statement on the religions themselves, it's just using the imagery, which I'm not going to complain about because it's awesome. Many of the mainline games focus primarily on a battle for control between Yahweh and Lucifer, which, if I need to explain that, I don't think I need to explain that.
God and the devil.
Yeah. Digital Devil Saga is predominantly about Hindu myths of reincarnation and Brahma. It plays with religion in very interesting ways, and it's a very important thing to the identity of the series that plays interestingly as Persona moves forward. Yeah, I think that is most of what I have to say about Shin Megami Tensei before Nocturne. It is difficult to talk about in specifics because there are a lot of different spin-offs to it. But Nocturne does really do a great job of centralizing and crystallizing that aesthetic that it ended up going through.
I was just going to say that I think SMT3 is probably not the pinnacle SMT game, but it's kind of like the face of the series as it is now, in terms of like the aesthetic.
Fair to call it the pinnacle of the aesthetic.
Yeah, it is essentially like the whole vibe that they're going for.
Yeah,
really.
It crystallized what the gameplay meant, it crystallized what the aesthetic was, it crystallized what the overall themes and attitudes towards divinity were. It really changed the direction for the franchise. And,
which I do have thoughts when it comes to Persona in regards to that, because I think Persona 5 is kind of the odd one out, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, and we are actually getting right now into Persona 1.
The bad one. I'm kidding. I've heard it's all right.
We have not. That is not a game we've played, so we are going to be mostly skimming through this. But from what I've seen, it's basically just still SMT, right down to focusing on the phase of the moon.
It's basically, I don't know how many of the SMT games involve high school students, but it just feels like an SMT game. What if it wasn't the apocalypse and there were just like high school students, which I wouldn't be surprised was kind of like cash in on like maybe the anime side of things, maybe, question mark.
Persona 1 does have a lot of 90s anime influence. I can hear the main battle theme as an OP.
Yeah.
Which is, it's just very strange. You just said the original vision for Persona was take SMT, make it not the apocalypse, make it about high schoolers. That is going to become extremely relevant later.
Yeah.
A lot of Persona 1's aesthetic stays with mainline SMT. It has the same overall scheme for dungeon crawling, in first person, walking through tile-based dungeons. With much of the tiling is the same. This is before Nocturne. This is just an element of the SMT aesthetic that permeated the entire franchise. What makes Persona 1 a bit standout in it is that what those tiles depict are very, very grounded. It doesn't get the surrealist liminal space vibes that later...
Yeah, I mean, liminal, I will have to emphasize, is such a good word for, like, the SMT aesthetic. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I think the big thing with Persona is, like, despite the obvious fantasy or, like, urban fantasy thing going on, it's super grounded.
Yeah.
The characters are kind of meant to be relatable. And in essence, one can kind of view Persona 1 as, like, the missing link. I mean, obviously, yes, it is, but like, it's kind of the monkey before it started walking.
Yeah, it's Homo erectus.
Essentially, yeah. It still looks like a monkey, but it's walking.
Yeah, and one thing that really stuck out to me when I was skimming through a long play is that the character focus is right there. It came out the gate swinging.
Yeah, and especially like it kind of has the same kind of party-based system, which you'll see again and again in Persona. Yeah. By virtue of just kind of being like SMT but not, it also is kind of the Persona with like the least identity to it. It's a bit of an extreme statement, but I feel like the other games will have such clear and distinct aesthetics that it's kind of interesting to look back to Persona 1 and be like, yeah, this thing kind of just feels like weird SMT that doesn't really have much in terms of, like, if you compare it to even other SMT games, they have so much character in comparison to Persona 1, which, again, I'm not trying to shit on it. It definitely has its own aesthetic and vibe. You know, compare it to Nocturne and, like, Digital Devil Saga and, like, Soul Hackers, and it just feels like the most generic JRPG-ish kind of game of the bunch, really.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is fair to say and fair for the game to have true about it. It is, as a spin-off, still finding its feet. It came before SMT in general found its feet with Nocturne.
Yeah. So we can move on to 2 if you want.
We are now moving on to Persona 2, something that I have not done as much research about, and I am going to just let you go off.
Okay, so
this is where you get to shine.
I low-key kind of love Persona 2, even though I've only played like one game in the duology. I think in terms of their gameplay, which is not the focus of the video, they kind of suck. Kinda. Like, they're very, like, boring dungeon crawling games. But I think it's a game that is just pure vibes. I think it really takes the late 90s grunge aesthetic and just runs with it. Not only in terms of its aesthetics and music, which has this, again, it really kind of dials in on like SMT3 before SMT3 was a thing, but also keeps the grounded setting. So it just kind of has this surrealist, like urban fantasy, like late 90s vibe to it that just kind of kicks ass. I think, you know, later on, maybe in post, you can kind of like put some of the music for Persona 2, especially like the overworld music. It does a great job.
Okay.
Yeah. It does a great job of like creating a sense of place and this kind of like dark urban fantasy. There's this like, I think the opening for one of the games, I think it's Persona 2, that's just so freaking good. Like
that awakened a memory in me. I have not seen those openings in 8 since I was originally discovering.
I think it's the one where like the shadow is like the police officers like chasing a guy up on a roof, and then there's like this girl at the school, and then like she turns into a shadow, and it just has this great like dark fantasy, like dark urban fantasy vibe to it, and that's like the kind of aesthetic that is really coming through.
It has the horror tinge to it.
Exactly, it is. In a sense, it's the most Junji Ito of the personas.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about commonalities with Junji Ito in the ways that he handles characters in relation to how SMT handles them, and in the ways that their visual styles accompany that. Junji Ito's characters are there as vessels with which you experience the horror. They're not really there to have an impact on the plot in most, which I think parallels with SMT very well, but we've been over that. Like, they're focused on the apocalypse, not the characters. I'm gonna let you continue on with Persona 2.
It also dabbles very good in that kind of liminal vibe and kind of dreamlike aesthetic really, really well, especially like in terms of, I think something we should also definitely touch on is like how the hardware, or more specifically the era that a lot of these games come from, affect the vibe of it. Because like PS2 and PS1 games have an aesthetic, even though they could be completely different games.
Yeah, like I think that all consoles have a bit of an aesthetic to them. I'm personally more in favor of the GameCube aesthetic, but what are you gonna do? I'm a Nintendo baby. And the Dreamcast is famous for having just the Dreamcast aesthetic. With all those Sonic games, Jet Set Radio, and the like. It's always interesting to see that. I do have some notes on how the hardware comes up in the Persona 5 section of my notes, but that can wait. If you have anything else to say about Persona 2, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Definitely the Persona with the strongest horror vibes, especially with like, the urban legend aspect of it, because I think the gist of Persona 2 at the start, or like the hook, is essentially like, oh, if you call this number, like your dreams will come true, and that's exactly that same kind of like 2000s, late 90s kind of The Grudge, or what was the one where the lady comes out of the TV? The Ringu, where like you kind of just have that sort of aesthetic and vibe to it. It's really, really cool. And yeah, of course, the PS1 aesthetic.
I wonder if that angle of urban myth launching you into a supernatural phenomenon would come up later in the series.
Oh no, absolutely not. They totally forget about it. Like they're never gonna touch it again. But
Persona 3.
All right. Yeah. Speaking of,
ladies and gentlemen, funky colors.
Persona 3, full disclosure, and 4 are two of my favorite games of all time. I like them more than 5, even though they probably don't play as well as 5. So Persona 3, I feel doubles down on the horror vibe of 2. It has that same kind of like dark urban fantasy mystery vibe to it.
Yeah.
Mystery in a different sense, not the Scooby-Doo sense.
Yeah, it's a thriller.
Totally unrelated.
It's a thriller, It's a thriller, not an episodic kids show.
I wonder what I'll be referencing with that. But yeah, it kind of, again, just doubles down on the grunge, especially given the 2000s, which I think is a huge part of like that game's aesthetic.
Yeah. Emo and scene cultures had no shortage of influence on Persona 3. This is really where Persona 3 came into its current form, largely helped by the fact that they got a new director on for Persona 3 compared to the previous 3 games.
And it absolutely has that je ne sais quoi, like 2000s vibe to it, especially as people who grew up in that era. It's hard to quantify, but that kind of like turn of the century kind of thing, I guess. I don't know if I'm like correctly assessing the 2000s as a whole era like that, but
like Persona after 3 is extremely tuned into youth culture. How accurate that has varied. They've had points where they really succeed and points where they really fail.
Out of 5.
Only adults, am I right?
Yeah, I fucking hate those guys.
I would call the Persona 3 UI clinical in many ways. I might be associating Makoto with Takemi and the vector graphics in the UI and the general blueness. But
yeah,
it is the blue game. Those vibes. Again, emo and scene culture.
Also, the ocean, which is interesting because, like, the remake, which I guess is kind of interesting because
this is the remake.
Yeah,
the reload comes at the end.
Yeah, I know, but it also has a bit of an ocean vibe because it's Tatsumi Port Island, which is near the ocean. I think it's like the only game that is set near the ocean. I think. Question mark. I think 2 was also set maybe near the ocean, but I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, like the sea kind of plays a huge part in it. It also kind of doubles down on the anime aesthetic more than 2 ever did. I think 2 is like very grounded, I think. Like, yes, they were high schoolers and later adults, which is interesting because, like, I think Eternal Punishment is like the only one where the characters are adults. But yeah, it just kind of goes for the whole like, hey, we're a bunch of high schoolers staying at like the dorms.
The character designs are a lot closer to realism than the modern moe style. Mm-hmm. It reminds me in a few ways of like, what if Perfect Blue was made by someone who wanted to have a lot more fun with it?
What if Perfect Blue wasn't grim?
Yeah. What if Perfect Blue, but we give one guy a party hat for no reason?
I'm glad you brought that up because Persona 2 just feels like Perfect Blue in terms of its vibes.
Huh. We have officially moved on to Persona.
I know.
Yeah. I'm not.
But so does Persona 3, which is interesting.
Yeah, a little bit. Like Persona 3 is again distancing itself from it. It's a big leap from 2. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I really want to touch on is Tartarus. Just specifically the aesthetics of Tartarus.
Yeah, it's really like this kind of surrealist space.
Like, I don't think that any other Persona game has dipped into or captured what Tartarus gets. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think any other game has dipped into it narratively. I don't think any other game has dipped into it on a gameplay sense. I don't believe that they've dipped into it aesthetically. And I am very excited to see what they do with it in Reload, because I can draw a comparison between Tartarus and a lot of the dungeons in Nocturne. Nocturne has an extremely specific visual language for sanctity. It's all about pale light and, again, geometry. It is about scale, and it is about walking through the circuitry underneath something way, way too big and way too obtuse for you to understand. It is in these repeating patterns and sparse geometries that it finds God. And Tartarus carries a great deal of this forward. A lot of the spaces within Tartarus are not very impressive on their own, getting that detached surreality from their layouts. They are entirely lacking in purpose. It is, by definition, liminal space. Without purpose, it is a space between.
Yeah, I mean, they really do love their liminal space in SMT/Persona, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And I say that, but I would definitely call Persona 3, where we fully diverge into, like, pop Shin Megami Tensei. This is definitely where it's starting to become its own separate thing.
It is the point in the series where, like, if you played it, you can more clearly draw a line to its later successors or children than you would by playing Persona 1 and 2. Like, you tell someone who's played 5 that Persona 1 is, like, in the same series, they'd probably call you crazy. Yeah. But interestingly enough, Persona 3 is, and to an extent 4, are the ones where the SMT aesthetic is still visible. It's just like,
it is still,
you kind of got to look. Yeah, you got to kind of look at it a little bit.
I would not have gone off. It is still present. I would not have gone off about Tartarus the way I just did if it weren't still taking significant influence from Shin Megami Tensei.
Yeah, especially just in terms of like the plot settings where it's like urban fantasy, liminal spaces, and like, it actually kind of leads me to the full moon sections of the game where like everything has this just sickly green like aesthetic and everything's empty, and like the coffins as like an artistic choice is so cool. Well, yeah, the Dark Hour, but like specifically during the Dark Hour you only tend to go to Tartarus, but like the full moon operations take place in like the regular world. So like you actually, I don't know if you knew this, but like you can go, like there's one point that's like an army base, there's another point that's on a bridge, another point in a shopping mall, and there's some really great boss aesthetics.
I did not know this. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, like if you can in the video, I definitely show some of the Persona 3 bosses because they look really fucking rad.
I know
and
about the Persona 3 personas. I'm not a fan of them aesthetically. Like, there's nothing
they're creepy, which I kind of like that.
I like that they're creepy, and I feel like Orpheus and the whole Thanatos Messiah line gets the creepy angle really well. Nemesis looks dumb.
Yeah, some of them look a little stupid, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't. They're not the best like aesthetics in the series, but I do dig that they kind of commit to the bit in essence of like Persona 3 is like the creepy game and like the horror emphasized game of like the modern Persona, so that just comes off like so much
Persona games so far.
Yeah, but then it's totally not going to be the case in a little bit.
Yeah, Persona 4 is not a game, it is an apology. They were contacted by Shinzo Abe and said, hey, you're not helping our national issue at the moment. And so Persona 4 happened. And ladies and gentlemen, yellow.
Yellow, sunshine, and vibes, I would say. Like Persona 4 feels like summer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really great. A lot of the nitty-gritty of it is that yellow is, of course, the main color, but there's a lot more contrast to it than 3 had with its blue. 4 is a lot more willing to experiment with the blues and oranges than most of Persona 3's UI was built from. Persona 3 is mostly blue, yellow, white. Persona 4 plays a lot more with different weird little accents. It has the SMPTE color bars, it has a lot of multicolor bands, it knows when to dedicate space to its main color and what it can fill with bullshit. In a way that ties into, again, youth culture of the time. It's an aesthetic sensibility that resembles a lot of early internet web pages, I find.
Yeah.
Look at some of those battle backgrounds. So many disparate, single elements with no real connection, with entirely separate hues and color palettes to them. It's so good, man. I don't know what the name for that is. It's so good.
2000s core, which kind of goes back to what I was saying. Like,
yeah,
it came out in 2008.
It's the
but
other
like
2000s core.
Yeah.
Persona 3 is the MCR crowd. Persona 4 is the Taylor Swift crowd.
Yeah, pretty much. It just kind of in essence it's also like part of the game's broader themes of like it's clearly intended, like all of the games take place in high school. I mean, almost all of them. This is kind of the one that's most intended to be nostalgic, even before you've played it.
Yeah,
if that makes like any sense. Like this is,
you can definitely tell that some of these writers have a very real love for small town Japan.
And I think that kind of, I know a lot of people, like there's a common saying, it's like, oh, Persona 4 is like living a life that I never lived. And it's like, actually, that's not true. There's a reason it's so relatable, and that's because it's everyone kind of like, grows up in a town. They, go to school, high school, whatever. Like it's a relatable feeling. It's not just exclusive to the country that it was from.
Yeah, it's not just about having the experience of small town Japan. It's about the fact that when you are that age, it is when your world is first beginning to grow outside of your parents and it's when you start to really develop a sense of self. The world and your capacity to explore it is growing around you, and whether or not the world actually is that big around you, whether you're in a small town or whether you're in the burbs or in the big city, your scale as you move through the world changes in ways that the game emphasizes very, very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just
hello,
the game...
Matrix Adachi. What are you doing here?
I thought it was thematically necessary, absolutely.
Yeah.
But getting back on track, I mean, the game, in summary, absolutely has just like a fun vibes to it, from the J-pop music to like the bright colors, the, as I said, summer vibe. But going back to horror... I do think it still has the horror aesthetic, despite the fact it is the cheeriest, like it is the happiest M-rated game I've ever played.
Exactly. I love the contrasts of. I love the use of contrasting vibes in Persona 4.
TV World
One
fucking
thing that I
rules.
had mentioned is that a lot of the color palettes in the overworld can feel a bit washed out. Might just be a consequence of the fog symbolism. Might just be the PS2 because like that's what all the games before Persona 5 look like to me.
Mm-hmm.
It is fun for selling the idea of the boring nothing town, and the boring nothing town is really great for a place where news spreads fast, and if something happens high in the air, you can see it from everywhere.
Dude, Persona 4 is Silent Hill. Hear me out.
Persona 4 is set in gentrified Silent Hill.
Which
That's what it is. It's gentrified Silent Hill. We've cracked the code.
I mean, it's like completely accurate because the fog does exactly the same thing. It's just this kind of oppressive weight that falls on the town and like the TV world. Where like the first time you see the TV world, it has the same vibe, like not the same vibe, but like a similar kind of like horror aesthetic that TARDIS really brings of this weird liminal dreamlike space that just doesn't make sense. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the contrast.
Dreamlike during this.
Take a shot every time we say liminal and dreamlike. You will die.
Oh lordy. Speaking of the TV world, I'm not really sure how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the main theme of the game is truth, where Persona 3's was death, and I do feel like it's sort of the weakest of Persona's single-word thematic analyses.
Its dungeons are a little boring, if I'm being honest. Like, as much as I love the game, one of my favorite games, to criticize it, as blasphemous as it may be, it's just a lot of rooms running on a theme, and that theme isn't always great. That said, what was the second to last dungeon you got to do before, like, if you want to get the best ending? Like, help me out here. It's the forest something. No, like the forest something.
Oh yeah, I don't think I did the forest of something. I did not do the golden chapter.
Okay, well, that's a little awkward, but like I think they kind of find their stride again in that chapter. It has some really good themes. In terms of like your favorite and least favorite dungeons, in terms of vibes, what would you say?
Oh shit. I think I'd say Naoto's lab.
Hate or like?
I think I'd say I have to really appreciate Naoto's lab, yeah.
Interesting, because I'd say that's like almost my least favorite in terms of like the vibe that it has. It just feels a little like goofy, which is not bad. Like I don't dislike it.
It is a little goofy, and I do completely understand how that could turn somebody off to it. I really love the mad scientist vibe of Shadow Naoto.
Mm-hmm.
It leans a lot harder into, as I said, like the webcore aesthetic of things, where it's very corrupted, it's very bright, and it's very every color at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that is a bit of a jump for a lot of people. It's kind of an intense aesthetic, but I think the chaos of it does sell a lot of Naoto's turmoil. It does sell a lot of... It's like an undercurrent that was running through all the other dungeons that really just spouts up right here. Least favorite... Yukiko's castle.
Yeah, it's just kind of like whatever.
I don't really have anything to say about my dislike for that. I have something to say about my dislike for the bathhouse. Like, it's really good for kanji specifically, but what am I doing here? What am I, like, why? It's just so much of so little.
Yeah, I don't necessarily dislike the bathhouse. It's just, it's unique, to say the least.
I feel like there's, like Shadow Kanji, one of the better shadows in the game. But, it feels like there's a lot of other aesthetic elements to a bathhouse that could be included and are not.
Yeah, I think it's just like it's meant to make the player uncomfortable, and maybe it's not the best age thing, but obviously, of course, we all know Persona 4 hates gay people.
Oh yeah,
but
Persona in general does that. You don't start a game dropping the Tetragrammaton and not be homophobic. That's just how it works.
It's you kind of have to be to play these games low key.
Okay. Well,
I'm kidding. I am kidding. I am kidding.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, I guess if I had to answer this, I do love the last dungeon. It looks really, really cool. My least favorite, I think Yukiko's is a little boring. I will agree with that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I might actually say Naoto's because like it's kind of like the goofy aesthetic kind of like throws me off. I don't hate any of them. I think it's just like if I was gun to my head, I had to pick like, oh, I like this the most and I like this the least. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I do find that a lot of the overall TV theming is a bit superfluous and disconnected. The game has 3 separate visual symbols for truth and obfuscation, and none of them ever really meet. It has the glasses, it has the fog, and it has the TV. And I think that the only place where any of them actually show up is in the shadows that aren't really relevant to any of the other parts of it.
Yeah, the glasses are an interesting one. Because like it kind of just doesn't. Yeah, I wish they did more with the TV aesthetic. Now that you mention it, like especially in regards to the dungeons, because there's a lot of cool stuff you could do if like the aesthetic and art were a little more unified in terms of like the dungeons and the TV world.
I think that's
still really like it.
I think that's more of a narrative note than an aesthetic note, because I pick into the scripts and the structure of stories a lot, and it really feels like the TV angle falls off really quickly.
Yeah, they kind of like, oh, TV, fall into it, and then it's like, okay,
fall into
murder.
It shows the nightmare that other people think of you as, and it shows what you're trying to hide from the world. Like, that's a very terrifying thing that leans into a lot of the mass communication angle that the game plays with. Goodbye to that once the copycat killer just runs into it to hide, and that's the sum of how it is used.
It
becomes the murder weapon instead of a whole setting.
That said, as much as we are criticizing it right now, I still consider 4 to have the best. I don't want to say narrative because I actually think 3 has the best like story in terms of plot, but I think 4 has the best narrative ? And I think a lot of that's carried by the characters and the town itself.
Like the delivery of it is absolutely expert. The parts of it that are greatly focused on is the friendship between these characters and the ways that they interact with each other and the ways that they grow up. I do have a bit of a comment on how they evolve between Persona 4 and Persona 5. Specifically, Rise and Naoto are sort of standout members of the party in Persona 4. They're the ones who aren't just normal kids, really.
They're essentially the outsiders of the party.
I know, and it feels like, objectively, that's what they ought to be, but it feels like in some ways they just kind of assimilate into the party with a bit less friction than there ought to be. And Persona 5 doubles down on that. Where in Persona 4, a lot of the cast are, again, more or less just normal kids. Persona 5 makes sure that every single party member has an entirely unique and distinct life path up to the point where they join into the party, united by those rotten adults.
I've heard a great thing comparing the two, where it's like in Persona 4 you kind of feel like they're just actually friends, because like that's how people become friends in real life. They just kind of like, it just kind of happens sometimes. Yeah. Whereas like in 5 they just kind of feel like coworkers.
a little bit.
Yeah.
It really does suck sometimes, because like individually I think on average a lot of the cast members are a bit stronger than Persona 4, because when everybody has something going on except for Anne, they can definitely have a lot more of a standalone interest from the player. I think that Yusuke and I think that Futaba are genuinely effective because they are separated from the rest of the cast in that way. Yusuke by going to another school, Futaba by
Yeah. I will say I like 4's characters more than 5, but
yeah,
I do. Yeah, like 5 also has a really great cast. Which should we begin to move on to 5?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do there.
5, the
feel like we
worst
moved there a
one.
few minutes ago.
My bad. I think we were so official before, and I was like, oh shit, we're just kind of low-key transitioning into it. Essentially, I think if I were to rank them, Persona 1 has the weakest like aesthetic and vibe to it. Persona 5 is actually, I would consider second to that, if that makes sense.
It does not.
I just don't vibe as much with it's less the how well it's done. It just feels like such a weird departure from the rest of the series, given like as we've brought up the weird dreamlike vibes to it, the horror, the kind of urban, supernatural fantasy. It's an entirely different thing, and I vibe with it in terms of like series variety. I don't necessarily like love it though.
Yeah, I think I do see a bit of where you're coming from, and I have a bit of a different opinion on it. The comic book aesthetic is jaw-dropping to look at. Like the things they do with menus, the things they do with battle transitions are genuinely just incredible UX. It is unbelievably effective with how much it actually has happening and how legible it is.
I definitely agree.
I have no concept of how a comic book aesthetic plays into the game's symbology in anything but a surface level.
I think it's kind of like, superheroes fight injustice and so do the Phantom Thieves, I guess.
Yeah, like I thought, like I said, that the TV symbolism in Persona 4 kind of got lost. Like the comic book aesthetic no one ever found it. It was just there.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool as fuck. Again, I don't want to make it sound like I hate.
Yeah,
It's cool, but
I love looking at it, and I think that Persona 5 is my favorite game aesthetically just off of the back of it. But like, I really wish there were like a bit more to it. Go ahead.
I think we should maybe discuss like the overall vibe of it, where it's kind of like very 2010s. So as I said, these all reflect the eras that they're made in, which like, I mean, no shit, but like, especially given that the whole half of the game is about like living a life, like a normal life, like as a student or whatever, it comes across so much more. So it has that kind of popping 2010s, like very hip and like modern aesthetic to it, which is unique to say the least.
Yeah, the masks are, I think, a pretty apt way to crystallize a lot of the game's aesthetic. Obviously, you don't name a very prominent track beneath the mask without having an idea in your head. And I think it taps very interestingly into the lifestyle of Shibuya, this being the first time where a Persona game has taken place in a real named location, to the point where they had to like ban cosplayers from Shibuya.
I did not know that.
They had to like give cops permission to get people out of there because there were so many people going there just to cosplay and for photo shoots.
Yeah, it's an incredibly busy street if you don't know what Shibuya actually looks like.
Yeah, like if you think that like all those people who like are milling about as like faceless whatevers in the game, there's like 5 times that many of them there.
Yeah, the game's NPCs don't actually do justice to how busy Tokyo is.
Yeah. It is up there as the most densely populated areas on Earth, and it makes for a real spectacle because it's also one of the most walkable. Like, you don't really drive much in Tokyo.
Yeah, I mean, it just would be, I imagine it would be a pain in the ass to do so. Like, full stop.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes, it's actually part of the game's aesthetic of like, urban life.
Yeah.
Like anybody who's lived in a major city, I mean,
yeah, like the masks are, again, like it's a pretty nice metaphor for the head down, don't really pay attention to anybody else lifestyle of such dense urban living. And then you have to contrast that head down meek little Akira boy to the dastardly phantom shtick up.
Yeah, I do vibe with the kind of like thing, like the comic book aesthetic is a lot of fun when it's just like you don't really think of it as like a Persona game and the other games, because like the way that they just do like the all-out attacks and like, you know, the bright reds. I know I'm kind of like covering ground we already went over, but like it really works well independently.
It's a
of like the rest of the series.
It's a maximalist aesthetic. It does a lot. It throws a lot at the wall, and most of it sticks. It just sticks to itself. Like the aesthetic is like a tumor. It's a really fucking cool tumor that does weird shape-shifting shit. It doesn't actually gel that well.
Yeah. And I think that's just kind of like my grief with Persona 5. It's not that it doesn't do what it does extremely well and I don't love it. It's just I dig the horror vibe of the series, and
Yeah.
that's not what I got out
Persona
of it.
5 was when they dropped the Shin Megami Tensei Sure title to the games. Like the original Persona 5, it has that on the box, and nobody knows what it really, like nobody knows what it's talking about. Persona 5 does not have Shin Megami Tensei on the box, and it is absolutely when Persona cuts all ties and becomes its own thing. Persona 5 also has the most varied aesthetic. Like the Persona 4 spin-offs, they mostly stick to the same glitz and glamour of the Persona 4 aesthetic. Persona 5 does have a lot of very interesting and subtle variation. Strikers has a whole alternate aesthetic based in Sophie, which is entirely illegible. Have you seen the shop in that game?
Yeah, I also don't like Sophie's character design. I just want to throw that out there.
I like Sophie's character design in something that is not Persona.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit, which it kind of goes to the 2010s vibe of it, where it's like that just feels like a very 2010s anime character to have in the series.
Yeah, Sophie is the minimalist corporate logo of Persona.
Yeah.
Which is a really out of place thing to have. I love Sophie. She's up there as one of my favorite characters to play as in Strikers, but she doesn't look right next to everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, Persona 5 has the most varied aesthetic between Sophie, Persona Q2's Chibis, the A1 Circle of Hell, and with Persona 5 Tactica, we're getting into panty and stockings somehow. Like, the proportions in that game are wild.
I mean, like, I commend them for, like, trying different art styles in the spin-offs, but it kind of doesn't help the game's kind of lack of visual cohesion. Well, in like a broader sense, not in the actual sense. I think the game has an absurdly good kind of like jazzy vibe to it, especially like in its more quiet moments. But
yeah. Persona 5 is an absolute treat to experience, and it does have a lot of substance. It just misses out on a bit of the synergy between the two that previous games had a lot of. I am very, very interested in a lot of the influence that it's had on the greater JRPG space, and particularly how Persona has affected Shin Megami Tensei after Nocturne. SMT games in the PS2 heyday have always been very lonely experience. If a character recurs, they will do so like 3 times. But after Persona's success, that's not a thing anymore. SMT4 has a party of a law member, a chaos member, and a girl who do basically nothing for 90% of the game.
I love that comparison. It's like you got all this shit and a girl.
That's how the game fucking portrays it. Like she does.
I believe you. I 100% believe you.
I think that Devil Survivor is kind of where Persona influence started hitting SMT, and I think that game does it very well because it stays focused on like the apocalypse conspiracy. It's like if Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne started like 5 hours earlier. But it's really, really weird the way that Persona's character focus has reflected back on SMT, because SMT was not a character-focused thing. It was always about the weird setting and the weird apocalypse and the ways that it came to be. Even in the character-motivated sections of Digital Devil Saga, it was always about, this is how data works. This is how this character's power works. This is how we have come to this really weird scenario that we're currently in. But now in SMT5, instead of having just you there, other people making it in ways that you don't really need to pay attention to, you walk in with a whole party of people who next to you are grossly unqualified to be in the Hell Zone. SMT5 is an isekai, which SMT3 is also technically an isekai. It is related to a cult ritual and sacrifice where the world ends. SMT5, you walk under a bridge, it collapses, and you are now in hell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take your word for it. Because I haven't played this series as much as you have.
Yeah.
I mean, Yeah, I definitely feel like that just feels like the natural kind of like conclusion that Atlas would make is that like Persona is just the more popular series. The JRPG aesthetic is just gonna, well, not the JRPG aesthetic, but like the kind of JRPG necessity to have like party members and like have it be very memorable in terms of its characters and story probably has greatly influenced SMT, especially like more recently with some of the SMT spin-offs like Soul Hackers 2, I think is like a very party-based game, though that is a spin-off, so I'm not gonna like,
Yeah.
you know,
And like I
include it too much in
don't
the...
I don't have as much of a problem with it in Soul Hackers 2 because like the party members that you use in battle are the guys who are plot relevant. But in SMT4 and SMT5 and SMT4 Apocalypse for that matter, they don't really do much. They're not a part of your actual party. They're just kind of hanging around while you do all the work. It doesn't work. Kills a lot of the lonely and isolated vibes whenever they show up. It focuses on a lot, like the presence of so many characters and so many different motivations needs to focus a lot more on a direct plot that isn't as much about exploring the apocalypse scenario and is instead about having a plan that involves it somehow. Shin Megami Tensei 3, 90% of what you need to know about its apocalypse is in the opening cutscene. The world turns itself inside out, the devil drops a tapeworm in your eye, and you're just going to town on the pixies now. SMT4 has a lot more spinning plates, and it is appropriately weird in what it does that I can understand why it takes a longer time to get to it. You have a samurai who disseminates manga to spread literacy throughout the world, and somehow that's turning people into demons.
Kind of going on this theme though, do you feel like 5 is like a return to form in terms of the aesthetic? Because like from what I've seen of it, it reminds me a lot of like Nocturne.
It borrows a lot of very surface level visual elements from Nocturne. Like it's largely set in deserts and ruined buildings that are all in grayscale, which is again a return to form with Nocturne, but the apocalypse scenario that it sets out to create, I have no idea what it is. I don't know how it started. I don't know when it started. I don't know why it's even that big of a deal when people can just live and go to high school in this weird little parallel pocket dimension God tucked everybody into. Another thing that I skimmed over a little bit is that SMT has always had a moral alignment system in the force of law versus the force of chaos. Law is God, chaos is the devil. Both suck. I tend to lean towards chaos because it's, hey, what if we kept this setting interesting? But
I've always heard like the middle road is like actually the best choice.
Sometimes.
Okay.
Like it varies game to game. Like some games, the law ending is the best one. Sometimes the neutral one is the ending. Sometimes like in Nocturne, the game is very chaos themed, but the neutral route is literally the worst one. Because you need to go for like the special secret dungeon route if you want to get the actual fun ending.
They do love doing that in Persona 4.
Yep.
And only Persona 4. The other ones have like completely straightforward best endings. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's funky. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in modern SMT that is influenced by Persona, and I don't think I like because it misses a lot of what SMT really had going well in the PlayStation 2 and like early DS era, in favor of something that Persona just does better already.
It kind of brings me back to what I was saying about 5, where it's just like this departure from like, yeah, 4 was like happy-go-lucky, but you still had that kind of like contrast of like horror and like creepiness and like all that stuff. And with SMT kind of just not having that anymore either, it feels like the vibe is going extinct. And that's like so much of the appeal of some of those earlier games.
Yeah.
From Persona 2, Nocturne 3, and it's just like, you know, I hope...
Like, the intro scene to Digital Devil Saga is a trip.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't know, just go watch it because it's unhinged. Like, there's barely any explanation, but it's still immediately obvious as to why this shakes a lot of things up. It doesn't feel the need to explain things because some of them are self-evident, and it saves what's not self-evident for big dramatic reveals.
I was just going to say, I do hope that Persona 6 kind of leans into that a little bit again. My worry is that they're going to see the success of 5 and they're like, clearly, you know, we got to do this superhero aesthetic again, which I really hope they don't, but who knows, really. I'd love a little bit of a return to form in terms of just like, you know, I feel like 4 and 3 and 2 kind of have a very grounded feel, whereas like 5 doesn't, and that's fine. Like it works for 5.
I think that 5 is still definitely like within the ballpark of giving the good old school buds vibe. It's plain close to the fire on becoming unrelatable.
Yeah, dude, we totally hate 5, right? Right, commenters. I hope they give you so much grief over it.
I love Persona 5 to pieces. It is like Persona 5 Royal is my second favorite JRPG. Period. Not JRPG. It is my favorite RPG. It's my second favorite RPG. Period.
So. Going on the theme of like the future of the series, we do have upcoming game.
I do think I actually have something interesting to say about.
Go ahead.
As you said, the loss of that weird horror vibe.
Mm-hmm.
The detail-rich world design, the way that you have to put specific, unique details in places instead of aggressively reusing things. That's a big part of what's biting into the liminal space vibes. It's present in Persona 5, and it's present in SMT 5, where every room needs to be an entirely unique mesh. It can't be an arrangement of tiles and rooms in a nonsense scene. It needs to fit together as a coherent museum. It needs to fit together as a coherent school. Some of the dungeons in SMT 5 are really, really bad because they're dedicated to replicating a real environment.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my last things to say is an entirely petty gameplay thing that I don't think most people will care about, and some people will say is like a good thing to change. Persona 5's buff spells. They go on the one person, they stay for 3 turns, and then they're gone. Classic SMT buff spells affect the whole party, and they don't go away unless they are dispelled. You can stack 5 stacks of Rakukaja, 5 stacks of Sukukaja, 5 stacks of Tarukaja, and it's amazing. It makes a great way to really feel like a rising momentum in your gameplay as you move forward, and a good way to use all those extra press turns you're getting. SMT5, with those press turns that work so well to stack buffs, returns to the Persona style of individual person buffs that only last 3 turns, and I want to cry about it.
It is interesting to see how Persona 5 has just been super influential in terms of like how the series is now and how it might be going forward, for sure.
I want to stack buffs, man. I want to stack buffs. Yeah. It feels like every time I would get that up, I would know full well that I am blasting through the health bar, I am making progress, they're missing me, and I'm just skipping their turns, and I'm on top of the world. And then when I eat the Dekaja, yeah, it bites, but it means I just have to like pick myself back up, stabilize, and reload.
Amazing transition. As I guess we're kind of rounding off the video now.
Yeah, a little bit. It's been I don't know how long it cuts down to, but it's been 1 hour and 15 so far. Persona 3 Reload. I had Persona 3 on my to playlist for a while, but after seeing these trailers, I guess I'm waiting until Reload comes out because, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because like, on the one hand, you're probably going to play the best version of Persona 3, which, oh my god, I've never seen, well, not never, but like I've definitely not seen a lot of games have this confusing of like which game is the best version to play going on.
Original, Fez, portable, Fez has
Reload.
an epilogue, but apparently it sucks or something.
It's not even that it sucks, it's just like it's not fun to play.
Oh.
It's like the game on hard mode, which, by the way, Fez is like easily the hardest Persona game. And then like it's just mostly dungeons for like 30 hours, and then like little bits of story. Like if you Google the story on like YouTube, it's like an hour, which is like really, really not good for like a 30-hour expansion.
Ow.
But I guess moving on to like Persona 3 Reload and like Persona 3 aesthetic wise, I like what I've seen so far.
I really, really love what I've seen. You said that A lot of the superhero aesthetic was really biting into your enjoyment of Persona 5 because it felt disconnected. And it's really nice to see that the Persona 3 remake has not really transformed the aesthetic. It has just elevated it with all the tricks and techniques that they've learned from Persona 5 and everything that they've made in Persona 5.
Add to that, I think the beauty of like what they're doing with Reload now is like the aesthetic feels very uniform. Again, I way back kind of mentioned the ocean thing that they had going on, and that's just such a great way to like get the blue to have like make sense.
Yeah,
in
you
it.
have Makoto just head down drifting in some of those menus, and like when you walk away, you just hear me say, "Please, oh baby, don't go."
Yeah, it's really nice. I think the team kind of gets it.
Just brush right over my Kingdom Hearts reference. Why don't you?
I've never played Kingdom Hearts, and I probably never will. So that was a failed
I'm
attempt.
a Kingdom Hearts fan. Let that color your opinions on what I say about Persona aesthetics. By the way,
I will say I do have a concern. A big part of why I really love 3, at least aesthetically, is like the 2000s, mid 2000s vibe it has going on. I wonder how well that's going to actually translate to the game, because like I do have the concern that it's like they're just going to modernize it without really doing that intentionally, if that makes any sense. It's easy to just kind of have Persona 3 feel like it was set whenever. But like if you ever seen the video for like Burn My Dread, you know instantly what era this game came from, and I wonder if that's something that's going to carry through.
I do have a lot of faith in it moving forward well, because so far a lot of what effects have been added are fairly literal transcriptions of like the facial banner that crosses over the screen instead crosses behind the shot of the persona and shatters. I feel like that is just taking existing elements and rearranging them very slightly to maximize impact and like the whole slick and quick feel that Persona 5 had. I feel like a lot of what it does is solve a problem that I have with Persona. Persona 5's overbearing aesthetic in places tends to reflect it to the player as an abstraction. It is not the actual reality of what is happening. It is a choreographed scuffle. It's above and beyond reality, even beyond the scope of fantasy. It dips away from the urban in urban fantasy when you dip into a palace.
Yeah.
And what I think Persona 3 is doing very well is taking that extreme on all fronts aesthetic and using it to highlight instead of distract from a more representational view of the battles. You just have much more down-to-earth armor design, which easily does leagues upon leagues of work for that. Instead
Incredibly
of like
funny.
instead of elaborate spandex costumes for a fetish party, you have like real armor. You have real like communications gear on the shoulder. And I was
gonna say, before you continue, it's really funny they got rid of the armbands.
Yeah, the armbands were something that like a lot of Persona 3 has aged really, really well. The armbands did not.
I mean, it would be kind of weird then,
it was a bit weird, yeah. I guess it's just like the internet would be too hype. The internet culture has changed where like that would immediately get jumped on. Like,
yeah.
Like the internet wasn't really a thing and it didn't have like the hyper awareness of like parody and meme culture to really riff on that at the time. I'm really glad that they changed it now, because if I saw a Ken just giving some speeches with some old, some Austrian artist dialogue, I would be upset.
Yeah, I think it's like an actual thing, like those armbands, like for clubs in Japan.
It is.
So it's just one of those things that probably doesn't carry over.
Yeah,
as
like
well.
It doesn't carry over. Like when that game was made, they did not expect this type of audience that they would eventually garner for the reload. Like when they're making it predominantly for Japan, like set in Japan, like they're making it for Japanese people, and then like, hey, it's also getting localized because hey, that's a bit of extra money.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to take the elements of the culture and just transpose them very literally. when you know you have a global audience, like they know they do with Persona after Persona 5, you gotta think about this shit a little more.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do have this line in my notes that Persona 5 is a stage play in its aesthetic, where it's all deliberately dressed up and the characters are choreographed in sync with it.
Mm-hmm.
Reload looks like filters on a skateboard video in the best way. It's not masking the reality; it's only accenting it.
Yeah, I'd say so. That's a kind of pretty good way to put it. They really get what I think worked well for 3 in terms of just its vibe and its aesthetic, at least from what I've seen. I mean, marketing material is marketing material, so who really knows like how accurate that is going to be to like the final product, but I think they get it. Grim, dark, urban fantasy vibe and the kind of pop punk aesthetic. If you haven't heard the new battle theme, it really is really damn good. And it really is. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's somewhere.
Reload theme. It is in a tab now.
Yeah, but I think I'm definitely excited to see what they do with it. It also kind of brings up the question: if 3 Reload is really successful, would that cause them to recalibrate how they think about 6? If 6 is leaning more towards being like Persona 5, what if
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Like I have a number of things in my head that I catalog as like really, really, really effective art that I resent for its influence alone. The Lord of the Rings is that, Pokemon is that, to a certain extent FNAF is that. Like it kind of blurs the line because FNAF was never that exceptional, but like I really don't like the impact that it's made on the ways people look at stories on the internet. But I really don't want Persona 5 to join that camp. I don't like the way its influence has shaped SMT, and I really don't want its particular issues to be transplanted into further Atlas projects. It's weird.
I think it's like it's good in any series to just change things up, but like especially when it's the most successful in the series by a fucking huge margin.
It borders on the most successful in the genre.
Yeah, potentially. Like, honestly,
if you discount Pokemon, what other JRPG has sold that much? Final Fantasy VII? Not even that. Like the game industry is so much bigger.
Yeah, it is genuinely a juggernaut at this point, and it's easy for people to kind of smell the money, and it makes me worried that because throughout this video, if there's one theme that we've gathered is that the series is constantly evolving, and every entry has a very unique character to it, and it would be a crying shame if that stopped.
I feel so bad for the ways that my simplifying Shin Megami Tensei into pre-Persona, post-Persona. I feel really, really bad about that because there's so much individual variety. You have Devil Survivors in the now internet-enabled storytelling. You have the Digital Devil Saga like Gang Apocalypse. You have Digital Devil Saga 2's really just whack-ass sci-fi Resident Evil shit. There's so much variety within Shin Megami Tensei that it is hard to talk about as a monolith, which is so strange to me because going into this, I genuinely thought I could take the Nocturne aesthetics and treat that like a monolith, but it has failed. It is such an incredible franchise to get into, and it is so rewarding for the ways that it is so different from game to game. Maybe this is just me growing up on a diet of Pokemon homogeneity, but oh my god, if you think Pokemon has ever changed, you're wrong. If you go from Digital Devil Saga 1 to Digital Devil Saga 2, you will see more difference.
You heard it here, kids. Play Persona, don't play Pokemon.
SMT. It's Pokemon, but with Satanism.
So awesome, basically. Pokemon, but awesome.
Pokemon, but awesome for people who really, really don't want to like mariachi ever again.
I've heard of that boss. It's gonna be interesting when I finally get to SMT3 on my backlog.
I think it's like the third boss in the game, and it's the only one that actually feels like a boss.
Yep,
Like,
so I've heard.
I've gotten past him, and I don't think any other boss in the game lines up with that. Anyways,
I do love those fuck you bosses sometimes, but
you
yeah.
gotta love a nice casual filter, man. SMT5 made it a big fuck up Hydra. SMT3 funky Matador, man. Is that all we have to say?
It just might be.
Dot matrix Adachi. See you later.
Adaki.
Oh, you little piece of shit.